All right, all right. Hello and welcome everyone to today's BrainHQ Academy webinar. We're so glad that you could be joining us. My name is Stephanie and I'm one of the co-hosts for today's webinar, and I'm also the multimedia specialist here at Posit Science, the makers of BrainHQ. Today's webinar is a part of our BrainHQ Academy series, where we normally talk about the intersection between neuroscience and other topics, but today's webinar is going to break the mold a little bit. Today's topic is the history of brain health. So let's go ahead and welcome our guest presenter today. Mike, can I have you come on in and say hi to everybody?
I'd be
Oh,
glad to do that.
yeah, there you are.
I knew I could make myself present. It's nice to be with everybody today.
It's really great having you, Mike. I'm really looking forward to the talk today.
Okay.
Now, for those of you who have maybe attended one of our webinars before, Mike may look familiar to you. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with Mike, my co-host today is Dr. Michael Merzenich, and he is the co-founder of Posit Science, our chief scientific officer, and one of the original brains behind BrainHQ. For over 5 decades now, he has been a leading pioneer in brain plasticity research, and he has published more than 150 articles in leading peer-reviewed journals. So we're very, very excited to have you talking to us today, Mike, about the history of brain health.
Well, it's nice to be with everybody. And should I get started, Stephanie?
Let me just briefly go over the agenda, and then I'll toss it over to you.
Let's do it.
Um, yeah, so just so folks know, today's presentation is going to be run by Dr. Merzenich, and following that, there is going to be a live Q&A for the remainder of the time. If you have any question at any point during the webinar today, you can select the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel to bring up the Q&A window, type in your question, and then I will do my best to curate those questions and get through as many of those questions as we can towards the end at the Q&A section. Now, we aren't going to be focusing that much on BrainHQ today, so if you have any questions about BrainHQ, you can send those requests to our support team. Our email address is support@brainhq.com. And we also have a support site at support.brainhq.com that will have answers to a lot of common questions about BrainHQ. I also want to make everyone aware that today's webinar is being recorded and a replay will be available on YouTube in the next week or two. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel for free at youtube.com/brainhq. And if you subscribe there, you can be notified when the video is available. If you don't want to do that, that's also totally fine. Everyone who is registered for the webinar today will be getting a follow-up email from me either next week or the week after with a link to the recording. All right, and I think with that, now, Mike, let's go ahead and toss it over to you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. So we're going to talk about the history of the science and medicine of brain health. And it's an interesting history, and I think you'll enjoy hearing a little more about it. So for the classic philosophers, the brain was a mystery. They did not really know what the hell the brain was for. And one of the great intellectuals of the classical period, Aristotle, thought that the brain was an organ that had the job of cooling the blood, and no role in the generation of personhood or in the things that we now associate with the brain was assigned to it. And in fact, all of that came from the humors and from the heart. And the medical era of that period, the four humors governed medicine. And that was the fluids that were in the body or flowed out of the body when it was wounded or when it was ill. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, never mind exactly what those represented. But in also Socrates and later in more detail, Galen associated those humors in their balance, not just with physical health, but also with mental status. So, for example, if you were very uptight and angry and anxious and maybe warlike, then you had too much blood. If you were the opposite, you were not very active and not and depressed and not very positive. You were phlegmatic. You had too much phlegm and so forth. So in medicine evolved around controlling the balance of those humors by removing some blood or trying to rid the body of phlegm or yellow bile or black bile. And that was a curative action or adding to it. Those were curative actions. There was also no real brain surgery, of course, where it's well below the era in which we understood how to perform surgery under acceptable sterile conditions, and in any event, the brain wasn't assigned anything like the functions it's now assigned. Now, people did make holes in the skull of the brain in a procedure called trepanation, and they did that to relieve pressure and to free edema and people that had intolerable pain. And actually evolved that procedure, drilling a hole through the skull, not into the brain cavity itself. I mean, they didn't penetrate the thick membrane that covers the brain, but they went through the skull. And that does relieve the pressure as it applies and can be curative for many conditions in which the brain has been wounded or the brain is swollen because of infection or other reasons like this. So it could actually be a life-saving procedure. And people did survive this. We know from seeing many, many skulls scattered in cultures across the world that this was not a rare procedure and that could be effective in a sense medically, but there was no brain surgery per se. Now, finally, after about 2,000 years of wandering in the medical desert, you could say predominantly applying the medical for humor's principle, there was a kind of revolution that began in the middle of the last, roughly in the 1600s, inspired first by anatomical studies of the brain, and they were enabled by finally by the religious authorities giving permission to dissect the brain and in autopsy to look at the brain in detail. And that led to the beginning of a recognition that there were specific locations of damage or distortions in the brain that could be associated with specific neurological behavioral loss or distortion. So the scholars, the medical authorities of the era begin to associate specific brain regions with specific behaviors and specific function. And that was the beginning, you could say, of a long, slow evolution of the science and understanding of the brain and its operations. Across the second half of the last millennium, there was also a new philosophical perspective that emerged in the Age of Enlightenment, when it was finally argued that your personhood was a product of the brain. At least it substantially resulted from your life's experiences. They obviously shaped what you're capable or not capable of doing. And they also, the sort of individual that you developed were related to your social experience, to earlier social life and opportunities. And so, I mean, this was, at the time, on some level, perceived as an anti-religious perspective. But John Locke especially argued that it was just God's way of basically creating the person that you are. Now, actually, how the brain accomplished this rather miraculous self-creation of you was, of course, still far beyond understanding. I mean, in the 18th century, we finally came to the realization that the brain and spinal cord and all peripheral sensory organs and nerves were electrical. And the first individual that appreciated that was the inventor of the battery, Alessandro Volta. This great Italian academic actually used one of the first uses of his battery was to plug it into his ear and discharge it. And he generated a almost unbelievably intense sound. He realized that electricity was exciting the hearing brain through the ear. And as a consequence, basically, he came to the conclusion that the brain was, in fact, an electrical machine. And then many experiments were done that involved stimulating the brain or stimulating the peripheral nervous system, demonstrating repeatedly that that nervous system, that brain, was, in fact, electrical in operation. By the early 20th century, we actually understood the electrical chemical basis of the nervous system's hardware in detail. We knew how electrical activity was transmitted on the fibers of brain cells and communicated from cell to cell across the connection between brain cells, the so-called synapses. So I had a pretty clear understanding of these basic principles by the middle of the 20th century. And in the same time, medical scientists had developed ways to directly record electrical activity from the brain. This was first accomplished in the 1920s. That was the first of our rapidly developing ability to be able to look inside the skull at the brain physically and functionally. In the 19th and early 20th century, we also entered an age of brain anatomy. And this was actually made possible because we developed new ways to stain the tissues of the brain, that is to say, to color them so that we could see the cells of the brain and could see how they were organized in detail in the structures of the brain. And so for the first time, we saw in glorious detail what neurons looked like. And we saw how they received information and cell to cell. We began to understand how circuits in the brain were organized, the complex machinery of the brain. We saw that every little brain region seemed to have differences and subtle differences, or maybe big differences in its circuitry. No one was better at this when the great Spanish anatomist Ramon y Cajal. Also, we looked at those details in brain organization, and we saw there were different regions in the cerebral cortex that were clearly distinguishable and bounded, you could say, sharply with every neuron's distributions within those areas looking the same. And then we cross a boundary and we're into another region. And Brodmann actually identified about 40 of these areas in the brain. Many other scientists also contributed to this science. And we begin to understand more and more about the function of these individual areas, how they contribute to a sort of macrocomputers that are contributing to a substantial part of our operations in the brain as it's receiving and interpreting information or controlling our actions. And this evolution in the ability to look at the details of the brain also led to our witnessing for the first time indications of pathology in the brain. Alois Alzheimer was one of the primary contributors of this when he identified the plaques and tangles that so clearly manifested the presence of a disease that's taken his name. In the late 19th and early 20th century, psychology and psychiatry slowly came out of hiding. It was developing in parallel. And those experiments were showing that learning, that changes in the brain followed scientifically documented rules. One of the great early contributors to that, of course, was Ivan Pavlov. And you've probably all heard about Pavlov's famous experiment in which he learned a dog to associate a ringing bell with meat. So obviously, if you show a dog a reward like meat, the dog is excited by it. The dog is anticipating eating the meat. And if you ring a bell, the dog's not excited in general. But if you ring the bell and then follow it with a reward of meat, the dog associates the bell with the meat. The bell predicts the meat. And so now when you ring the bell, in the absence of the meat, the dog is excited. He says, "Where the hell's the meat?" Now we know something has happened in the brain of the dog because the dog interprets the bell as associated with meat. So that means there's been a change in the brain. Now, if I ring the bell 1,000 times and not present the meat, the dog would be over it. That is to say, the behavioral effect would be extinguished. So all of these phenomena, many other phenomena, were documented by the experiments of Pavlov and others in the late 19th and early 20th century. We begin to understand on the first level of understanding how change was operating in the brain, how it was occurring in the brain as we acquired change through behavior. Now, how the brain actually accounted for and enforced these rules was not well understood, but it was a rapidly advancing area of study. It was largely inspired by brilliant conceptual recognition of the issues at hand in the brain and in behavior by the great late 19th, early 20th century scholar, William James. As we rolled into the 20th century, scientists began to define the functional operations of that more than 60 anatomically defined cortical areas, those supercomputers in the brain, and then showed that the wiring in at least some of those areas could be revised on a large scale, was plastic at any age. And one of my favorite experiments in this class was conducted by the great British neuroscientist Charles Sherrington, who later won a Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine. And Sherrington actually mapped in detail by electrically stimulating the surface of the brain of a monkey or a chimpanzee He mapped in detail the representations of movements that were evoked in great detail across the surface of the brain of these animals. He then applied his electrical stimulation repeatedly to a particular location in under sterile conditions. The animal basically lived through a period of active stimulation. And then he mapped the representation of the movement again, a second time later in the life of the animal. And he saw that repeated stimulation at just a discrete little location in the representation of movement in that homunculus in the brain exaggerated the representation of just that movement. And in fact, it occupied so much territory that every other movement had to be adjusted in representation across the brain. Now, the monkey or the chimpanzee lost no function in controlling their movement. They were still operational, even though that movement was now, in a sense, represented at a new location all across the big region of the cerebral cortex. And that's another way of saying that the wiring had to have changed. The effective wiring had to have changed. The brain had to be substantially plastic at any age. And Sherrington and colleagues thought that they were witnessing what happens when you learn any new skill. You basically repeatedly engage the brain, and that exaggerates its representation, refines its representation, and the consequence across time is the acquisition of that special ability or skill. Now, the Canadian psychologist in the middle of the century made another really important advance when he convincingly argued that cortical plasticity underlying learning must be time-based. That what was really happening is the brain was basically strengthening all of those things that occurred nearly simultaneously in time and strengthening them together on the basis to identify what went with what to represent anything out there in our world, or how it related to anything nearby in time, that is to say, that was associated with it. It was all time-based. The selection of information on the co-concurrence of information in time must be the basis of our organizing our brain to represent the things of the world, to identify their locations, their nature, their identities, and to control our operations in the brain in every way, on every level. Brilliant scientist, Canadian scientist, in the 1940s, 1950s. Now, your webinar presenter landed as a doctoral student in a research laboratory at the Johns Hopkins University Medical School in 1964. So we're gonna look at a time mark then. We're in 1964, and at that point, neurological and psychiatric medicine, excuse me, we're focused on defining a myriad of better defined clinical indications. So the long list of medical indications that we identify as the diseases of the brain applied in neurological and psychiatric medicine were being defined in increasing detail. We were locating them in the brain. And we were developing pharmaceutical and brain stimulation and brain surgical strategies that medical doctors, medical scientists believe could address those maladies. Like little scientific effort was actually directed towards developing strategies for strengthening neurological performance or for improving brain health. This was a neglected aspect of the academic science effort, you could say, directed toward understanding brain and brain function. Neurosurgeons were increasingly effective in treating neurological tumors and addressing the many problems associated with neurological injury and disease. Actually, neurosurgery was more or less invented in the 20th century because now we could operate complex operations could be conducted under anesthesia, you could say, under appropriate sterile conditions for the first time. And engineers in parallel were developing strategies for more elaborate and for higher resolution recording and imaging of living, behaving human brains. So much a part of modern neurological medicine, psychiatric medicine. The physiological psychologist, the descendants of James, Lashley, and Hebb, these great scientists of the earlier part of the 20th century, were now focused on understanding the neurological bases of plasticity expressed primarily in the Pavlovian model. So they quickly showed in the 1970s, early 1980s, that every aspect of the representation of what occurred in bipolar behavior, the representation of the bell was exaggerated, the representation of the response to the bell was exaggerated, the representation of the meat in the brain was exaggerated by training the animal to associate the bell with the meat. And begin to understand, they also documented the loss of the representation of the bell, the weakening of the representation, so it not represented any longer in any exceptional way as a function of behavioral extinction. They're actually seeing major changes in the brain that are occurring in this simple learning model. In parallel, mainstream scientists were intensely studying plasticity, primarily in infant visual brain. And unfortunately, they were coming to the hard and fast, and in the face of the neurophysiological psychologist, the rather astounding alternative conclusion that brain plasticity was limited to the earliest epoch of our human lives. And the greatest scientists operating in this area actually won a Nobel Prize for their contribution to this study of this developmental plasticity, Hubel and Wiesel, two great Harvard neurobiologists. Now, it turns out that nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the neuropsychologists were on the right path. The brain was, in fact, continuously plastic, but we lost sight of it for about 20 years. Medicine, education, in general, the intellectual community largely abandoned the idea that the brain was continually changing itself on the basis of our experience. I mean, how ridiculous this is, but nonetheless, we fell into this hole scientifically. Now, your honorable webinar speaker finally woke up to the obvious in the 1970s. And it occurred in part because, I always had my doubts, just so you know, because I was aware of this earlier and conflicting, and aware that we had no real way to account for these really undeniable observations. But my research team's development of the cochlear implant, one of the commercial cochlear implants, came from my laboratory, designed to restore hearing in an individual that was totally deaf. These studies produced unequivocal evidence, undeniable evidence, that the brain was capable of incredibly rapid and large-scale remodeling all across the period of life. Now, basically, in a cochlear implant, you introduce a stimulating electrode, to shock the hearing nerve. And the whole idea is to try to represent sound in enough detail so that conceivably you could encode speech for the brain in a new form as intelligible. Now, it's very difficult to control the electrical shocking of the nerve with a pattern that's anything like the detail of the normal inner ear. It's a little bit like playing the piano with your fist. It's very, very crude. And you can only get to the high frequency, the squeaky parts of the hearing spectrum. Well above in frequency, the normal frequency range that speech sounds are delivered and represented to the brain from the ear. A completely different area of the brain is engaged at every level by encoded speech in a cochlear implant. And so, not surprisingly, when we turned on the cochlear implant, people understood a little. Hey, that sounds like a robot. I'll never understand. It sounds like endlessly playing an accordion, all kinds of descriptions. But 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months later, people heard everything. They could talk to you on the telephone. We had people that were professional musicians, several people that went back and operated in their life, reestablished their career as professional musicians because their restored hearing was so complete, so effective. It was a miracle. And across the world, several other groups working on cochlear implants with completely different ideas about how to encode, represent speech also succeeded. And basically, when they turned their devices on, we thought they were crazy. They worked. In time again, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months later, people heard everything. And they said what they heard sounded just like speech before they lost their hearing, just like our patients did. Now, this was not a miracle of our engineering. I won prizes for this, for being a co-inventor of this device, but in reality, this is God's trick. This is Mother Nature's trick, not mine. The brain was obviously continuously, rapidly remodeling itself. And it had worked in an old patient, an 80-year-old, just as well as it worked in a 20-year-old. Now, that research led us to conduct detailed animal training studies. And in those studies, we saw that the cortical machinery was rapidly advanced by training. It changed on the spot. The better the animal was at the task, the more it changed. Training-driven changes directly accounted for behavioral gains and performance achieved through training. We did these experiments in a variety of different important ways. Okay, so the light went off. The explosion occurred. We realized that the brain was massively and continuously plastic, and we realized the potential practical significance of that may be greater, substantially greater, than restoring hearing in a deaf person, was the ability that in every person on planet Earth, conceivably, we could impact their brain health, their safety, protect them against the progression to neurological loss that could lead to mental illness or to neurological illness by engaging the brain in training, that potentially we could manage brain health. And so we set off to do that. Now, before I talk exactly about what we did, I just want to say that in these studies in which we studied brain plasticity initially, we saw that one key aspect of the process that expressed that plasticity was that, as Hebb declared, they were time-based. Functionally more capable, healthier brains were faster. When they got stronger, and almost everything you trained them to improve on, they got faster. And they got to be more accurate. They operated with substantially greater reliability, with higher accuracy. They continuously and very accurately and very reliably moved forward in action in the behavior that they were being trained on in time. We actually engaged the higher levels of the brain, and they appeared to be much more accurately controlling those excessive events in time. And with the brain's machinery operating after training, we saw a much higher level of local and brain system coordination. You could say that the cooperativity, the teamwork of neurons, because the neurons were now much more strongly coupled to one another, they were working more strongly in a coordinated, in teamwork way to extract information. All of this came from, or almost all of this clearly came from Hebbian plasticity, input coincidence-based changing in the brain. Now, all of these abilities we could see could be sharply improved in any brain through appropriate forms of brain exercise. Now, a second key aspect of the process that expressed plasticity was that they were all reversible. So in our studies, we deliberately took very old versus very young brains in the prime of life. And we looked at first 16, later more than 40 different aspects of their function, their anatomy, their chemistry, their functionality, and we try to distinguish what was different in the old brain from the young brain in those 16 different measures, or up to ultimately more than 40 different measures. In the same class of experiment, we looked at animals that had a terrible early life, or in human children that had had a terribly early life, and we looked at the differences in their brain as young adults from the difference of the brain at an animal or a human that had had an experientially healthy life. And in both cases, we ask ourselves, well, how many of these 16, later 40 or more differences advantage the older person versus the person in the prime of life, the person near the end of life versus the person in the prime of life? How many of them advantage the experiential damage versus the experiential healthy child? And the simple answer was none of them advantaged the older or the experientially damaged child. Everything was stronger, more intact, more complete, healthier, more effective when you were younger, or if you had the unfair advantage of having an experientially healthy childhood. So then we ask the question, well, what if we train these individuals? If we trained older rats, or trained rats and kids who are citizens, trained rats and kids who endured very difficult childhoods, what could we change these brains in an advantageous way? What could be changed? And it turned out that everything could be changed. All negative changes attributable to aging or to stress or fear-plagued early lives that we scientifically documented were reversed. So what was recovered? Well, the machinery was recovered, its chemistry, the nutritional support of the brain was recovered, its defenses, its information processing machinery, its ability to remember, its executive control, the blood supply that fed the brain, whatever its neurological limitations or distortions, your brain is waiting for you to engage it on an active passive self-correction. Now, with this new understanding, we focused on, you could say, harnessing the genie in our animal and human studies. First of all, by trying to deepen our understanding and strengthening through training the machinery that's actually controlling brain plasticity. Why would we do this? Because we wanted to make brain plasticity, a time spent in training, to be as effective and useful as possible. We want to increase the learning rate, the power of the brain to change. And many brains we knew that were damaged had weakened machinery in this respect. We wanted to recover it, strengthen it. We also wanted to drive improvements in those great important qualities that we saw change in speed, accuracy, memory association, and coordination of neurological processes at every level of operation in your brain, which translates to broadly improving your organic brain health. We want everything to be fixed insight that we could think of. Now, we created practical training strategies to help you very efficiently engage in these powerful, now science-based forms of life-changing and life-extending brain exercise. And as you know, hundreds of controlled research studies now richly document the benefits of this form of brain exercise, and millions of children and adults have benefited from its use. So note that experience-driven remodeling of your brain is physical. This is nothing mental here. The brain is actually changing its physicality, its physics and chemistry, in ways that basically account for its change as you acquire ability or improve ability or recover brain health. The product of all that physical change is the creation of a better person and overall a unique person, because it's based upon quadrillions of moments, an unbelievable number of changes that have occurred in your lifetime, and you're absolutely one of a kind as a consequence. You are, like every human on planet Earth, a continuous work in progress. No one's done changing, hopefully for the better. You can change for the better all across the span of your life on Earth. And the behavioral capabilities of almost every individual, no matter how good you are at what you do, that can engage in brain training, if you can do it, you're almost certainly improvable. Now, I want to make one last point on this line, and as I said, it's just as easy to drive the brain in a reversible or negative direction. You can do that. You can do that at will. And to do that, what you need to do is just add chatter, just add noise in the process of the brain. And you do that basically by not exercising it enough, by not keeping it operating sharply and operating with accurately at high speed. You have to engage the brain in training to keep it in a good shape, just like you have to engage the body, of course. And brain health is degraded also by the negative and distorting things you can do. I mean, you can do a variety of things that are bad for your brain. You don't want to do that. And by what you don't do in managing your everyday life is really almost as important as what you do. It's not just that it is important that you exercise, it's important that you don't basically take life so easy and be so lazy about taking care of your brain that it goes to hell. And many things in life can degrade brain health. There's a long list. I could easily give you a list of several hundred factors that can degrade your brain health. And when these occur in a life, you need to address them. You should be aggressively addressing them. You should be monitoring what's happening to your brain. And when you have a vicissitude arise in your life, you should be addressing it by exercising your brain, just like you would exercise your body if you have struggling in controlling the movements or actions of your body. And of course, you might know that in your family there's a genetic risk for something like Alzheimer's disease, let's say, but many identifiable risks. And that should increase the intensity with you take on brain correction and brain strengthening. Now, I want to end by talking about a core change in brain health associated with normal aging, and it accompanies most other neurological and scientific struggles, and that's a decline in what we call processing speed. And again, that's the speed of action of the brain and its accuracy. And it turns out that speed of action, the speed of operations in the brain declines from about your 30th birthday, those are the big red dots in the graph, to your 90th birthday. You can see that in the average, this is an average of many hundreds of individuals, you can see that there's a steady decline roughly from your 30th, and the difference is large scale. And you can see that every other measured human ability shown in the simple illustration, episodic remembering what's in your past, spatial visualization, reasoning, those are declining in parallel with speed of processing. Speed of processing is closely related to how well you're doing to your intelligence, to your operations, and a whole series of cognitive measures. You can see one thing is improving, and that's your vocabulary. Well, of course, you're learning new words up to a certain point before you begin to tail off. But in general, you're going to hell in parallel with the change of speed of processing. Now, it turns out that processing speed is the carrier in the canary in the coal mine, typically undergoing this dramatic change. And again, all of these declining abilities can be relatively easily measured. You can document them on BrainHQ, and you can rejuvenate them at any age on BrainHQ. So here's a simple example of improving speed of processing by training in a very limited period of time. And what you see in the red are the before training. It's a function of age. You can see age is on the left. People are 20 years of age, and at the right, they're more than 90, almost 100 years of age. And you can see that speed of processing is slowly going to hell as you move from your 20th birthday to your 95th birthday. And now we train you. And the difference in after this equal period of training in these several thousand individuals, you can see it's about equal because people have gone through improving their learning rate. The older people are learning just as fast as the younger people. And you can see that very significant differences in speed of processing are occurring. Now, of course, if we train more, if you're at an older age, you'd move farther. Okay, but we only train for a limited period of time in this example. Now, your processing speed is a big indicator of both the brain's general performance and its organic health, as I said before. And now if we look at this improvement, we look at the average 70-year-old, and we see that after training in this very limited period of time, their speed of processing is better than the average 20-year-old. This ability in a human, like in a rat or a monkey, can be completely recovered by appropriate level of training, you could say. The performance gains in this ability must be accounted for by the brain remodeling itself. That's how it's accounted for. That's what has happened to account for this improvement, this change. Now, very large experimental trial has demonstrated the important generalized consequence of training-driven improvement of processing speed. One of the examples of such a trial is called the ACTIVE trial, where 2,800 individuals were trained, and 600 of these individuals were trained to improve their processing speed. And you can see that at the beginning of the trial, that is, say, at time 0, over a period of about 10 total hours of training, the processing speed was approximately twice as fast. Now we go forward to a year, and we train a little more. And by training a little more, we actually improve the processing speed a little more, but we're sustaining it. Now we go another year without training, and we look at these 300 people or so that were now in the special second training, that went through the special second training, and we see that they're still almost as good as they were right after training, even though they haven't been trained for a year. Now we wait another year and we train them a little more, and by training them a little more, they're back almost as good as they were. We're sustaining it, and then 2 years go by. No training, and you can see that they're still close in performance to their ability immediately after training. They haven't really been training much. The total amount of training is about circa 20 years at the most. And now they go forward another 5 years without training, and you see that on the average, they're all better than they were at the beginning of training. And now we look at the 10-year benchmark, and we see that all kinds of other positive things have occurred in these individuals. Half as many traffic, far safer driving, reliable, sane driving. They're still driving their car at an older age. They're driving more confidently, more effectively. They've improved their everyday performance abilities. They perform everyday tasks at higher speed. They're protected against senior depression. Many fewer are depressed, and the people that are showing signs of depression, that it's less serious. They better sustain their independence. They're healthier. They have better quality of life. They have lower medical expenses. They have less everyday functional difficulty over that 10 years. And they have a 29 to 48% reduction in the incidence of dementia if they've gone through the initial training, and then a year later they've had 2 or 3 or 4 more hours of training, and then 2 years after that they've had 2 or 3 or 4 more hours of training. The reduction in dementia incidence across that next decade was 48%. Now that's a big difference for not very much time invested in training. Now, this research group has just completed an analysis of the results achieved after another decade of training. So they narrow out from an initial phase of stage of 74 years of age. We looked at the 10-year consequence at 84 years of age, and now on the average, they're 94 years of age. And across that second decade, the reduction in the incidence of dementia is still 25%. Which is a big and highly significant difference. So a little bit of training early in there at age 74 and a little bit more additional training at age 75 and in age 77 has had a big impact on their brain health and made them much safer against the progression of dementia. Now, this is the first study that's shown that any form of brain training can have such a consequence in an individual as they age. Now, this all generates important what-if questions. I mean, what if we've been managing their brain health all across? What if we assured that everyone that entered this trial was trained enough so that they were safe? What if they started training them earlier and we kept them in a brain healthy situation from a younger age? So that by the time they reached their 74th birthday, they didn't have to worry very much about it. They could monitor it and keep themselves safe forever. And what if we train them more? If they had any loss in impact, and how many more would we see protected? Certainly many more, undoubtedly many more. So what changes when the brain struggles in its old age? Well, everything changes. And what can be reversed by training? Well, everything can be reversed, we think. And how difficult it is to reverse the course of change? Well, it's not very difficult. And can such training in humans delay, block the progression of dementia? We think in at least most cases, that's the case. And the scientific study of these issues provides us with a straightforward basis for people to manage their brain health, to strengthen, then enduringly sustain your brain health and to improve your brain power, whatever the cause of your personal struggles. Don't wait until you find yourself in trouble. Don't wait until you're falling off the cliff or driving your car in the ditch or lost in the woods. Your brain, like your body, is begging for exercise. So, guys' sakes, give it what it's asking for. Give it what it's needs. Thank you very much. We're working very hard to help you. And I strongly encourage those of you who are not into it to get into basically appreciating the fact that your brain is begging you for exercise. So get to it.
All right. Fantastic work on that presentation, Mike. Thank you so much for taking the time to share all of that with us. A lot of fascinating stuff in there. We do have quite a few questions starting to come in. And once again, everybody, if you have any questions for Dr. Merzenich, feel free to click the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel and type in your questions to us, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those questions
And
in the remaining time.
I want to say, Stephanie, that to
Yeah.
interrupt you, that if we can't answer all your questions, then I'll look at the questions that are unanswered later, and I'll try to answer at least a few of them that seem most common or worrisome to people that are raising them. So I'll make a post webinar effort to do that.
All right, sounds good. Maybe what we can do is put some of those questions in the follow-up email that goes out next week.
That's a great idea.
Okay, great. You heard it here first, folks. Okay, so a couple of questions that came in during the presentation. Anthony was asking, why don't neurologists, psychiatrists, and psychologists look at the brain with imaging and diagnostic tools like other medical and dental specialties? Can we look at a brain using MRI, fMRI, qEEG, PET, etc.? Can you talk about the different ways that we can look at the brain?
Yeah, well, they do, and we do. And in many of our studies, of course, the scientists have used these strategies to document the changes And it would be very possible that we're trying to encourage the use of these strategies, especially in individuals that are especially in difficult, struggling situations. Now, one of the reasons that this use is attenuated is that these tools are expensive to apply for in the medical system. So, but still, it can be highly valuable. And repeatedly, what we see when we train the brain, when people look in the physical brain or the actions of the brain, they see that it's changed by training in a positive way. It's more active, or maybe in some instances where you're calming the brain, it's less active in a disturbing or distorting way. So, in all kinds of ways, scientists have documented these changes. Now, it turns out that we learn an awful lot just by measuring performance limits in the brain. So we don't have to necessarily image the brain to know that the brain has changed in ways that would be physically observable if we did look at the physical brain. So that's another aspect of this. So one thing about brain training and measuring how the brain change is changing you is that in a sense you're getting a glimpse into your physical brain. And you're getting insight into what things must be like in there if you could really do these things this well, this reliably, with this high level of accuracy. So that's another aspect, is that ultimately we're also developing, for example, we can give a single assessment, and it's very highly predictive of the general status of a brain system. When we look at the brain system physically or functionally or in imaging, we basically see it confirmed in what we see in the brain system. So it's a complicated business, but it's a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a couple people asking for some clarification on the active study and what the intervention was. Um, I can take a swing at it, Mike, and then if you want to jump in with any corrections, let me know. But my understanding is that the active study, the original dosage was 10 hours of training, about 2 hours a week over the course of 5 weeks. And there were three intervention groups and one control group. There was a memory training group. There was I forget the second group, but it had to do with like mnemonic. Yes, the reasoning. Thank you. And then there was the speed processing group, the people who trained on what's now double decision in BrainHQ.
And then there was the control population that did nothing.
Exactly. And so the results that we're seeing, especially from the active study announcement earlier this week, is that people who had done the speed intervention training, so the double decision exercise, and had done the booster training after year 1 and year 3, that was the population that went on to have a 25% reduced risk of going on to Alzheimer's and dementia.
That's correct. That's right. Correct. The booster training was really important for driving a strong effect in these individuals. I mean, there were some individuals in the initial study that only had the initial training, the initial 10 hours, but the effect was much stronger in individuals that had those two additional doses, you could say, at year 3 and year 1 and year 3. So that's really interesting. It's really interesting that basically just a little bit of additional training to sustain the effect resulted in such a long enduring impact. And ultimately, no benefit was seen over the long run with these other forms of training.
Yep.
And ultimately, you saw the performance of the people that were untrained get worse and worse and worse and worse, of
Yep.
course.
Just declining over time.
Right.
All right. So, we do have a lot of other questions coming in now. So let me briefly scan through them and see if there are a couple of repeat questions. Um, Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of questions about whether BrainHQ can help with certain conditions. So we've talked about Alzheimer's and dementia briefly, but there are people that are asking about can BrainHQ help people who suffer from excessive stress or grief or vascular dementia or other various conditions. Can you speak to that a little bit? I know BrainHQ isn't technically a medical device, so we can't like use it to diagnose
Right.
any of those conditions, but
Well,
um,
one of the critical things, Stephanie, and I tried to make this point, but maybe it got past people, was that you have to be able to do it.
yeah,
Okay, so there is a limitation of people that have progressed to dementia to a point in which they're unable or unwilling to engage. So you have to engage, and you have to be able to engage or be willing to put up with it in a sense. So, and some people are past that in their medical condition if it's gone too far. But if you can engage, it almost does not matter what your condition is. You can anticipate that you can improve in your performance ability. And you can do that not just if you're very, in fact, what you see is that the more you're struggling, the bigger the positive changes. You could say you have a longer distance to move in a good direction. So don't hesitate. I mean, my dear mother-in-law, near the end of life, had a head injury in a car crash. And as a consequence, she basically performed in cognitively at about the fifth percentile. We intensively trained her on BrainHQ. She died a normal individual, cognitively normal, completely with it. So almost everyone that struggles neurologically that can do it will benefit from doing it. So that's one of the important messages for people to get across. Just because you have real struggles, there is an opportunity for you to be better if you can do it, if you will do it.
yeah, that is yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. We have so many people that it's kind of tragic that will come into, the one of our customer support channels and say, "Hey, I have this loved one in my family that is experiencing XYZ. They can't use a computer, but can Brain HQ help them?" We're like, if they can use a computer, then there's always a chance for that growth. But
Right.
yeah,
Right. Yeah, and been working in the background to try to improve it for people that are so impaired.
yeah,
To have sort of voice controlled and other strategies to train people that can hear but can and see but can't necessarily difficult for them to act, you could say. And the same for people that can't hear or people that can't see. Their brains are improvable if we get them into an intensive program of training, but we have the special problems that relate to their infirmities.
yeah.
So we'll get better and better and better at this as time passes. We don't
All
want to
right.
leave anybody who can get past their struggles on the sideline. I know that's our dream.
Yeah. All right. Here's a fun question from Barbara, which I think, Mike, is going to be right up your alley. Having been on the team that one of the co-creators of the cochlear implant, parents are told that if their child is not reading by the third grade, they will never be a proficient, fluent reader. How true is this?
It's, I'm sorry for the cuss word, but it's okay. Most children that can't read because they have poor phonological receptive abilities. That is to say, their listening brain is not very advanced in basically processing information at speed and in detail. And and if that's the problem in about 80% of non-readers or poor readers. And if you just train that ability, you can normalize them. And when you normalize it, then you still have to go through reading training. But if you normalize it and go through reading training, the kid can learn to read with a normal proficiency. So we've trained several million children to learn to read by training their listening brain to be more accurate as a sound receiver, so that now they hear the details in the incoming speech that is translated by letter. If you don't hear those details, the translation makes no sense. Reading makes no sense. And that's the way these children struggle. Now, there are other problems that about 20% of readers have a different problem, but it's all addressable, or most of it is addressable by appropriate forms of training. You need to customize the training to each child. So I think that we have the capacity to train almost every field reader to be able to read. And you're not limited to be the third grade. You can do it when they're, I don't know, 15 years old, 20 years old, 50 years old. Brain is still plastic. it can still be trained to more accurately receive or represent the sounds coming in from a hearing organ. So don't give up on it. And if the kid is over 10, the listening program in BrainHQ will work for the kid. We'll help you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
All right. So a couple of real quick, brief questions about BrainHQ that I want to answer, just because I'm seeing a couple repeat questions in the Q&A form here. A lot of people are asking how much training to do with BrainHQ. The short answer, we're going to go sort of into lightning round here. For the amount of BrainHQ that you want to do, the amount is going to be up to you. We like to tell people to shoot for 60 to 90 minutes a week. How you get to that 60 or 90 minutes is going to be up to you. For some people, that's 3 times a week at 30 minutes each. Sometimes that is, 15 minutes, 6 days a week and a day off. As for time of day to do the training, whenever you are feeling the most focused and alert is going to be your best bet. Maybe don't do it right before going to sleep if you are feeling kind of drowsy and you're having a hard time staying engaged. But a lot of people say that they like having it in the morning, with their cup of coffee as they're starting to wake up and they're, working on getting focused for the rest of the day. So, whatever time of day works best for you and your schedule, that's the best time to do the training.
Well, one of the things it's important to understand is that there's special value in training on successive days. However,
Yes.
so if you do train for 3 days a week, try to make those successive days. And because there's a carryover when you exercise the brain, there's a carryover in the time in which you're the quiet times, the rest of the day, and at night when the brain is actually rehearsing what you did in the day and it's actually strengthening it. And if you take it up again the next day, you get the benefit of all that rehearsal. If you wait a day or two, it weakens and you don't get enough day-to-day advantage. So the strongest benefit comes from training in at least 3 successive days. If you train in 3 successive days, you'd make good progress. If you train in 5, you'd make a little better progress, of course, and the additional time spent would be valuable. But just get to it in a regular way and try to do it over 2 or 3 successive days, at least a week.
All right. So unfortunately, we are already coming up on the top of the hour, so I'm going to do a very brief outro. But I will keep the Q&A open so I can answer a couple of those leftover questions there.
Stephanie,
Um,
do you mean you think I talked too long? That,
oh, no, I would never
that,
accuse you of
that
that,
was a
Mike.
joke. I'm so much for people having to hit me with a stick to shut up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all again so much for joining us for the webinar today. I want to briefly share with you our schedule of upcoming webinars. Our next webinar next month is going to be all about the personal trainer. That is an office hours webinar that's going to be run, I believe, by me and Henry. So bring all of your questions about the personal trainer. How does the personal trainer pick out exercises? How many exercises get picked for focuses and why? Any of those kinds of questions will be answered during that webinar. So be sure to tune in for that. The following BrainHQ Academy webinar is going to be in April, and it's going to be on AI in the brain. And that's going to be run by our senior scientist in-house, Dr. Tom Van Vliet, who some of you have seen in some of our webinars before. So looking forward to that as well. Just real quick, as a reminder, everyone who is registered for this webinar today will be getting an email from me sometime next week with a recording of today's webinar. We're also going to include any resources that we mentioned today in that email. So like we said, Mike is going to answer a couple of other questions, and I'll throw those in the email as well. The last thing that I want to say is that when the webinar ends today, Zoom should automatically bring up a survey for you to fill out. It'll take no more than 2 minutes to complete, and we would really appreciate the feedback, especially since this webinar today was formatted a little bit differently from our other BrainHQ Academy webinars. So do let us know what you think of it. All right. And Mike, do you have any final parting words for our audience today?
Well, it's been fun to go through this process. I wish I could see people in person. I mean, it's sort of sad that this has to be in this curious way, but interacting with them in this curious way. But yes, take your brain health seriously. And not just in by going to the Brain Fitness Center, but also by thinking about how you're living your life. Because your brain is you, and you want you to be healthy, and you want you to be strong and effective as long as you're on planet Earth. And if you take it seriously, that can happen for most of you. So be good soldiers and take care of your brain.
Absolutely. Thanks again, everyone. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, rest of the week, and happy brain training.